Okay, welcome everyone to Insights into the Weekly Haftorah. This week's parsha is parshat Terumah, and here we begin really a whole new energy in the Torah. Here is where God commands Israel to build a Mishkan. We're in approximately a little bit past halfway through the book of Exodus. The next 5 parshas, except for the incident of the golden calf, is all about making the tabernacle in the desert. 5 parshas. And then almost the entire book of Vayikra, of Leviticus, is about the service in the Mishkan. So this week's parsha marks a decisive change in the whole energy and direction of the Torah. And so we would imagine that the Haftorah would have something to do with the building of the temple, because the Haftorah is always parallel to something in the parsha. And this entire parsha is about building the Mishkan and the different instruments that were in there, the menorah and the showbread and the holy ark and the incense and the altar. Everything begins in this week's parsha of Terumah. So the Haftorah is taken from the first book of Kings, the 5th chapter, beginning with verse 26. And this is the beginning of King Solomon, Shlomo Melech, building the temple. And so it's not the whole building of the temple here, but this is the beginning of Shlomo building the temple. So the parallel, the correspondence between the parsha and the Haftorah is very, very clear. So where it starts with, and there's a lot of detail here. I'm just going to go into a few very important points here, is that it begins, the Haftorah begins by saying, V'Hashem natan chachma l'Shlomo, kasher diber lo, v'hi shalom ben Hiram u'ben Shlomo, v'yichratu brit shnehem. So it begins before it starts talking about the temple. It says, and God granted wisdom to Shlomo, like he promised him, and there was peace between Hiram, he was a king up in Lebanon, and between him and Shlomo, and they made a covenant between them. And then it goes on to explain that Shlomo levied a tax on people, not a money tax, but in order to build the temple, his tax was he gathered 30,000 men. It could be very similar to what we call today the reserves in the army. In other words, here 30,000 men were gathered together. This was like a tax in Israel. This was like an obligation. And they were sent to Lebanon in shifts of 10,000 per month. So there were 3 shifts. There would be 10,000 in Lebanon. They would come home for 2 months, and another 10,000 would go up. And what were they doing there? They were carving out the cedars of Lebanon that would be used in the temple. And he also had a second tax of 70,000 carriers and 80,000 quarry workers. In other words, this was a huge undertaking. 30,000, 70,000, 480,000. And it was a huge enterprise. And he had a covenant with Hiram. So I want to go back a little bit, because this is beginning in the 5th chapter. But if we go back a little bit in the book of Kings, so in the 3rd chapter, it says that God came to Shlomo in a dream. And he said, I will grant you a wish. And he said, it's because of my great love for your father, David. What do you want to ask of me? This isn't a dream. And so Shlomo, in the dream, asked God for an understanding heart to judge the people properly. And God's response was, since you didn't ask for glory, power, money, I will grant you an understanding heart, but I will also grant you all those other things that you could have asked for. And he ends by saying, and if you follow my ways, you will also have long life. So I'm mentioning this because that's how this Haftorah begins, that God granted Shlomo wisdom like he promised him. But for that, you have to go back 2 chapters. And then right after that, we have the story of, it was another Haftarah that we learned of the 2 women who gave birth at the same time, and one of the babies died, and one of the mothers exchanged the live baby for the dead baby, and they came to Shlomo for judgment, and he was able to identify who the real mother was. And his wisdom spread all over the world. And that's how our Haftorah begins here. And also, it mentions that there was a covenant between Shlomo and Hiram. And this is also talked about in a previous chapter. Actually, in the 5th chapter, because we're starting from the 26th verse, and it talks about how Shlomo HaMelech approached Hiram, and he told him how my father David wanted to build a temple for God, and now I am in the position to do it. And I know that there's no wood like the cedars of Lebanon. And so basically it was really a financial deal with him, that in exchange for the cedars of Lebanon, so he gave Hiram 20,000 we'll call it bushels of wheat, and 20, again, I don't know the measurement, a core of beaten oil. In other words, it was a financial arrangement, but nonetheless, Shlomo and Hiram had a very, very good relationship. The Haftorah continues with an important fact. The beginning of the 6th chapter says it was in the 480th year after Israel came out of Egypt that in the 4th year, in the month of Ziv, the month of Ziv is Iyar, what we call Iyar. The 2nd month is called here the month of Ziv. Shlomo begins to build the temple. And then there's a lot of details. And we know that it took 7 years to build the temple. And if you remember what we just said, the workforce was 30,000 dealing with the wood, and 70,000 people carrying the wood and the stones, and 80,000 carving out the stones. It was a massive undertaking, a massive undertaking. And so the Haftorah ends with God telling Shlomo that if you build this temple, it needs to be that you'll follow my decrees and observe my commandments. And if so, I will dwell among you, and I will never forsake the people of Israel. The implication is, if you don't follow my ways, then the temple will not be able to continue to exist, and my presence will not be in the temple as I've promised. And according to tradition, on the very day that Shlomo HaMelech inaugurated the temple, he married the daughter of Pharaoh. And the Midrash says that even though the temple was in existence for 410 years, that on the very day that it was inaugurated, already the seeds of its destruction were sown. And another Midrash says on the very day that the temple was inaugurated and Shlomo married the daughter of Pharaoh, that 2 reeds were planted in what would become Rome. So obviously these midrashim are telling us that the seeds of destruction, unfortunately, were existing already in the building of the temple. Because unfortunately, we learned that later, Shlomo kind of went, we'll call it off the derech, off the straight road, and it led to the division of the tribes as something that we're still, in a certain way, spiritually, still suffering for. So that is the Haftorah from the book of Kings, and we can only hope that now that we're back in Israel, God willing, we will see the 3rd temple, which will be an eternal temple, and it will be a temple of God's prayer for all peoples. May we see it soon in our day.